Welcome to the Spy Collection Digital Edition, where we are looking at spy artifacts that only exist in digital format. I'm Anastasios, and today's episode is about the cyber espionage operation from 2011, which became publicly known through this incredibly detailed cyber threat intelligence report by the National CERT of Georgia. Although this is an over 10 years old intelligence report, it's something that you would almost never see in unclassified reports today, since it reveals tradecraft that no government would allow to be published in today's world. This is the main source of our video. So let's start. Some historical context first. This is a USSR map where here you see Georgia, or Georgian Soviet Socialist Republic as it was called during those times. After the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, its intelligence agency, the KGB, got restructured to two smaller ones, the SVR and the FSB. The SVR was assigned any foreign intelligence operations, similarly to the CIA for the US, MI6 for the UK, DGSE for France and so on, while the FSB became more of a domestic intelligence service, similar to what the FBI is for the United States, Shin Bet for Israel, BKA for Germany, MI5 for the UK, etc. In the Soviet KGB times, all states were under domestic operations. Consequently, those were passed to the FSB, the Federal Security Service. This is why, even to this day, the FSB is conducting intelligence operations in the former Soviet countries, although it's a domestic intelligence agency. Now, if you paid close attention, you'd notice that the FSB was founded in 1995. That's because there was an intermediate state with another agency which eventually became the FSB. The FSK, the Federal Counterintelligence Agency, but that's a detail unimportant for this video. So this is why, although the FSB is an internal security service, it is still the one responsible for any operations in the former Soviet Union countries, and it's also why the cyber operation we'll see here, that was targeting Georgia, was executed by FSB cyber operators. Back to the cyber operation, the FSB operators started by hacking popular websites in Georgia, then they were modifying specific content, like news articles, that could be of interest to their targets. Here is a list of all the websites they compromised as a preparation step for this operation. As you can see, it's mostly news websites. Here is an example. This was a legitimate article for a NATO delegation visit in Georgia. Others included US-Georgian agreements and meetings, Georgian military developments, etc. The modification was minimal, basically just adding a single line like this, which wasn't even visible to the visitor of the website. What this was doing was executing whatever is hosted on that website. Of course, that website was operated by the FSB, and what it was doing, it was to covertly inject a backdoor that would grant the FSB access to the visitor's computer. But let's take it step by step. Okay, so who were the victims? And we use the word victims instead of targets because it wasn't very targeted. Even innocent visitors of the websites were infected by it. In total, 390 computer systems got compromised, and naturally, 70% of them were from Georgia, and there were a few collateral infections from people outside Georgia reading those websites. Okay, but who were the actual targets? According to Georgia CERT, the targets were government agencies, critical infrastructure, ministries, financial institutions, and NGOs in Georgia. On a high level, once a person visited any of the compromised websites, the infection code would be loaded and covertly downloaded and executed on the user's computer. This code will connect to an FSB command and control or C2 server, and the FSB operators will start looking for any documents of interest to steal from the computer. But let's have a deeper look at each of those steps. This is one of the compromised websites. The legal entity under Public Law Enterprise Management Agency, which was used to manage the state-owned enterprises in Georgia. Everything on the website was exactly as designed apart from this single-line addition by the FSB operators. What this says is that any time the page loads, also fetch and load on the visitor's computer some code from this 173.212.192.83 website. Apparently, this was an FSB managed system. But what was this code loading? It was this. This was code exploiting a vulnerability in Internet Explorer. Basically, the use of legitimate websites to propagate an intrusion is known as a watering hole attack, since it's like wildlife that animals go to a watering hole to drink water and the predators attack them. Well, the same, but from a cyber perspective. The vulnerability exploited was identified by Microsoft in 2006 and fixed. Its unique identifier was MS06057, but still, many people had not patched their computers with the latest updates. The initial code was subsequently loading what is known as an exploit kit. This is a series of exploits which identifies what will work best for the specific computer and then runs the appropriate exploit program to take control of the system. Georgian CERT identified 3 exploits used in this kit. One taking advantage of Java, which was used extensively at that time. This one was discovered by the vendor in 2010, then the one we already talked about on Microsoft Internet Explorer, and lastly, a previously unknown exploit taking advantage of a flaw in PDF documents. This was something that no one has ever seen prior to this operation. Those exploits are referred to as 0 days, since it has been 0 days since its discovery. Please note that 0-day exploits are typically used by nation-state actors and other advanced adversaries, and their use is typically calculated, since if discovered, they will get fixed by the vendor and they can no longer be used for operational purposes. Once code execution was achieved, then the software implant bootstrap process begins. The first thing that the custom software implant would do is check where the system is located based on the time zone settings. Specifically, it was checking that the system has its time zone configured to UTC+3 or UTC+4, which corresponds to the countries you see on the map on the left. If that was the case, then it will inject its payload to the running instance of Internet Explorer in order to hide itself in case someone was inspecting the running processes. After this was completed, the injected code would try to contact the command and control servers. If this failed for whatever reason, then the software implant will connect back to the compromised website and access this specific URL that you see here in order to get an updated list of C2 servers. If the communication with the command and control server was successful, then the software implant will create a backdoor, name it usbserve.exe, and place it in the application data directory of Windows. This of course was done to mask the actual activity of the application. Next, it could configure the Windows registry autorun to ensure that this software implant will be executed anytime the system starts. Finally, it will start the software implant, which the first thing that it will do is reach out to the command and control server and check for any updates. If such updates are available, they will be sent in base64 encoding. The implant will decode them and replace the installed software implant with a newer version. This operation was running for quite some time, and throughout this period there were multiple versions of this custom software implant. According to the Georgian CERT, from March 2011 to December 2011, several new features were added. For instance, new antivirus bypassing techniques, encrypted and obfuscated payloads, support for another operating system, Windows 7, a new feature to be able to covertly record video from the computer's camera, a new module to scan the local compromised computer's network, and ability to spread within the local network of computers. It started on version 2.1 and the last known version was 5.5. Now moving to the C2 infrastructure, the first known command and control server was this one from September 2010. As you can see, the name used was georgiaonline.xp3.biz and it was deployed on a free web hosting in the US. The second C2 server was deployed in March 2011 on a compromised website, the third on a hosting provider in France a month later, and in total we have 10 command and control servers across 5 countries. They have been operational from September 2010 to March 2012, which is approximately 19 months. Out of all of them, one was running on a compromised website and the 9 others on rented hosted infrastructure. And here we have the first interesting part of this intelligence report. The Georgian CERT managed to get access to those command and control servers. And here is what the administration panel looked like. From left to right, we have the DDoS or Distributed Denial of Service, which was used to configure a DDoS attack. The Clear menu, which was to clear the compromised computers. The Bot, which was to manage all the compromised user computers. The Scan Disk, that it was searching the compromised user computers' hard disks for files of interest. The CERT, that was collecting cryptographic certificates installed in the computer. The Word, which was a search and collect for Microsoft Word documents of interest. And finally, the Coder, which was allowing the FSB operators to execute arbitrary commands on the infected systems. From the screenshots provided by the Georgian CERT brings this. On the left side, we see number 1 and number 2, which were the FSB configurations added to that target, and on the right side, we're reading Word and then a series of keywords. How this worked is that if the software implant found any files on the computer matching those keywords, it would automatically forward them back to the FSB operators. On the number 2, we see some words that don't make a lot of sense. However, this is because those are the actual Latin representation of some Georgian words. Those words: military, intelligence, and department. If any Microsoft Word document was found on the system matching those keywords, it would be automatically collected and forwarded to the FSB operators. And here are a few more. As you can see, CIA, NGO, Obama, Bush, Intel, and so on. Another example, and one more. The next screenshot is from the Bot menu. Here, on the left side, we're seeing the unique identifier of that bot, then its IP address, then if it's offline or online, and the options that the operator had. You can see download, listed directories, take a screenshot, obtain the password, get a list of the files, download the directory, and so on. What the Georgian CERT operators did after compromising those command and control servers was go to the history. This allowed them to identify further details of those systems. And for example, in this case, they identified that this was not a Georgian system. This was actually the Children's Healthcare of Atlanta Pediatric Hospital in the US. According to the report, these were likely collateral damage and not the intended target. Still, however, it gave the FSB access to those systems. So in the beginning, we mentioned that this was a very unique case because it was revealing tradecraft that you don't usually see in such reports. One example is this one, seeing how the command and control server actually works. But the Georgian CERT went a step further. They started a counterintelligence operation. In order to do that, the Georgian CERT used a few different sources they had available. The first was the digital forensics they had from the compromised computers as well as the command control servers they got access to. The second one was the ability to reverse engineer the software implant used and understand its logic and some key details helping in the attribution. Of course, we already talked about the covert access to the command control servers. And lastly, being a national security agency allowed them to work with the telecommunication providers to tap on the network traffic and see what was going in and out from those command and control servers. Based on that, they found three key evidence. The first was that the compromised Georgian computers were managed by systems belonging to the Russian Business Network, RBN, and that was discovered, as you see on the screenshot, by doing traffic analysis on the C2 servers. This way they found that the FSB operators were using this RBN to log into the command and control servers and manage the infected systems. The second evidence was that the software implant had rbc.ru hard-coded as a fallback command and control server in case all other means of communication failed. This was the Russian Business Consulting, also directly linked to the RBN. Lastly, the third evidence was part of the command and control panel. The command and control panel had the ability to send spoofed emails and was using the form that you see here to do so. The Georgian CERT operators reverse engineered that and discovered that anytime someone was sending some receiver emails, inputting some text, some spoofed sender email and was clicking on send, the command and control server was transferring the request to a system located at legalcrf.in. Here is a snippet of that code where you see the actual call to this domain name. What's interesting is that domain was registered by the Russian Ministry of Internal Affairs Department of Logistics, located literally next to the FSB headquarters. Knowing all of that, the Georgian CERT operators decided to go one step further. Now that they had some evidence that Russia was likely behind this operation, it was time to strike back. So how do you do that? First, they got a system within the Georgian CERT lab intentionally infected with that software implant. After doing that, they took the software implant developed by the FSB, modified it so that it's managed by them, they set up their own command and control server, and they put that software implant in a file named Georgian NATO Agreement. Then the only thing they had to do is wait for the FSB software implant to detect that file as matching one of the rules and automatically exfiltrate it, since it was matching the scanning criteria. Once this was done, the FSB operators opened that file and got infected, giving the Georgian CERT operators full access to their computers. On the left side you see some camera captures Georgian CERT managed to collect through this counterintelligence operation. But of course they didn't stop there. Now that they had full access to those operators' computers, they could collect way more. And this is exactly what they did. This is a screenshot from the operator's computer uploading some new version of the malware for Windows 7 from his computer to the command and control server. And the confirmation of this one is here, where you see the files that were recorded uploaded from his computer actually running on the command and control server. Using that, they were able to identify the telecommunication provider the operator was using, and also a company associated with M-Trend, the ISP of the FSB operator. Here is a screenshot actually of the FSB operator's computer from the command and control panel that was controlled by the Georgian CERT without him knowing. This was used, of course, to also capture some of the social media and other passwords that this person was using, like you see here, for email and the popular Russian social media VKontakte. And from the user's computer, they also found out that the username he was using was Stanislav. As you can imagine, there were many more things that the Georgian CERT managed to capture. For instance, here is that user from his computer logging into a forum using the nickname Stas, reaching out to his telecommunication provider, M-Trend, about issues with his internet connectivity. And here is the same user using the username Eschinkot1, which was also hard-coded in the software implant, asking about guidance for software implants development in a popular Russian hacking forum, hacker.ru. On the top post, he's asking about remotely changing the browser settings, on the second one about setting up a proxy, and on the bottom one he's asking how to add new exploits to a popular at the time exploitation framework known as Metasploit. To summarize, we covered an over a decade-old FSB cyber espionage operation targeting Georgia, the tactics, techniques and procedures used, as well as how the Georgian CERT was able to use them against Russia. Those spy versus spy cyber incidents happen on a daily basis. But in today's world, no one is as open about them as the Georgian government was back then. Because you don't see something, it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. Nothing's as it seems.